In the dense, suffocating jungles of Vietnam, every leaf, branch, and patch of dirt could be hiding death. American and South Vietnamese soldiers quickly learned that the most dangerous enemy was not the one firing bullets, but the one they could not see. The Viet Cong, outgunned and outnumbered, turned to a different kind of warfare, one that played on fear, disorientation, and psychological breakdown. Their weapons were not tanks or bombers, but sharpened bamboo sticks, tripwires, hidden pits, and venomous creatures. Simple tools, deadly designs. These were not traps built to simply kill. They were meant to haunt, to make a soldier hesitate with every step, to force him to question every movement, every sound, every shadow. A war zone already saturated with chaos and loss became something far more sinister, a place where the enemy could strike without warning and never be seen. A soldier might be walking down a jungle path, only to suddenly find himself suspended in the air by a net, or screaming in agony with a punji stick piercing his foot, coated in rotting filth to ensure infection. The purpose of these traps was strategic, yes, but it was also deeply psychological. The Viet Cong understood that fear, more than bullets, could erode an army's effectiveness. Morale did not break all at once. It shattered slowly, piece by piece, every time a comrade was maimed by a hidden spike, or when someone was bitten by a snake tucked into a helmet, or drank from a poisoned canteen. These moments were seeds of doubt, ones that grew into anxiety, distrust, and eventually despair. For the Viet Cong, the jungle was not just terrain, it was an ally. They weaponized the landscape, transformed nature itself into an arsenal. A trail was not a path, it was bait. A clearing was not safety, it was a trap. Every encounter became a game of survival, not just against human enemies, but against the very environment surrounding them. This was war without front lines, without predictability, without mercy. It was a war that rewrote the rules of combat and left behind scars that linger to this day. In this story, we explore how simple materials and ruthless ingenuity turned the Vietnam War into a battlefield of horrors, one booby trap at a time. We will uncover how these traps worked, the psychology behind them, the toll they took on soldiers, and the terrifying legacy they have left buried in the soil. Welcome to a hidden war, one waged in silence, in shadows, and just beneath the surface. They say the jungle has a voice of its own, a whisper in the leaves, a sudden stillness in the air. For the soldiers sent into the heart of Vietnam, those whispers could mean one thing: danger was near. But unlike the roar of gunfire or the whine of incoming shells, this danger was silent. It did not come from across the battlefield. It came from beneath your feet, above your head, and all around you. Invisible, patient, lethal. You never saw it coming. Imagine this. You are 19 years old, walking single file through a narrow jungle trail, sweat pouring down your face, rifle in hand, eyes scanning for movement. The sun is high, but under the canopy it is dim and claustrophobic. Then snap. Not gunfire, not shouting, just a sound like a twig breaking. Then comes the scream. The man ahead of you drops, writhing, his leg impaled by a jagged bamboo stake hidden in a pit, a punji trap, coated in filth to cause infection. It does not kill him, but it might as well have. He is out of the fight. You are shaken. You stare at the ground, now afraid of the very soil you walk on. That was just one trap. There were many more. The Viet Cong did not just fight a physical war. They fought a psychological one. They used what they had: bamboo, vines, mud, fire ants, venomous snakes, and turned them into instruments of terror. And what made it worse, these traps were not deployed randomly. They were designed to target instincts. You would avoid open space, so they would trap the jungle trails. You would seek shelter, so they would trap the clearings. You would take cover near trees, and that is where a net would spring up, hoisting you into the air like prey. The infamous bouncing Betty mine was a prime example. It did not explode when you stepped on it. It waited. Then it launched into the air and exploded at waist height. Designed to maim and dismember, it was not just about killing. It was about horrifying. You would see your friends screaming, bleeding, losing limbs. And worse, you could not fight back. There was no enemy in sight, just jungle. Tripwires stretched across paths, barely visible. You would only notice when it was too late, when the branch whipped back and a spike buried itself into your chest, or when the wire triggered a grenade beneath the underbrush. Every step, every motion felt like a gamble. And then there were the falling traps. Tiger traps, they called them. Deep pits lined with punji sticks, camouflaged with leaves and branches. You would walk across what looked like solid ground and suddenly disappear. A dull thud. Then silence. Maybe you would live. Maybe you would bleed out. Either way, your squad had to make a choice. Go down after you and risk another trap, or move on. One of the most chilling designs was the spring-loaded snap trap. A bent sapling or bamboo stalk held under tension, tied with a thin vine and armed with a metal hook or sharpened object. You trip the wire, and it whips forward like a beast lunging from the undergrowth. It hits your leg, your side, your neck. The jungle strikes first and vanishes. Net snares added another layer of dread. You would be walking and suddenly find yourself dangling mid-air, suspended by your own panic. If the trap did not kill you, it exposed you. You were hanging, helpless, while your team scrambled for safety. It made soldiers feel hunted, like animals. None of these traps were high-tech. That is what made them so terrifying. They were made from things you saw every day, branches, bamboo, rope. And that meant everything could be a threat. A pile of leaves, a crooked vine, a muddy puddle. Nothing was innocent anymore. The soldiers began to lose trust, not just in their surroundings, but in their own senses. How do you stay calm when the ground could kill you? How do you lead men when you are constantly looking down, expecting the earth to open up beneath you? Morale crumbled. Fear spread faster than bullets. And the Viet Cong knew this. Every trap was a message. You are in our world now. What is chilling is how calculated it all was. These were not random accidents. These were handcrafted instruments of horror, meticulously designed to demoralize, disable, and disorient. One soldier once said, "I was not afraid of dying. I was afraid of not knowing how it would happen." The cruelty was not just in the injury, it was in the anticipation. Because out there, in that choking heat and endless green, it was not about if something would happen. It was about when, and when it did, it happened fast. The jungle swallowed its victims whole, and for those who made it out, the jungle followed them home in their dreams, in the sound of breaking branches, in the unease that never fully went away. So if you ever visit those quiet trails today, and you hear the wind rustling the trees, know that once, not long ago, that silence was deadly. Every root and leaf was a weapon, every step a gamble. Because the Viet Cong did not need to see you to fight you. They only needed you to walk forward. And you always had to walk forward. It was not enough to wound a soldier. The Viet Cong understood that war was not just about who had the most firepower, but who could endure the longest. And sometimes, the most effective weapons did not explode or shoot. They rotted. They festered. They lingered in the bloodstream like ghosts. The jungle had its own way of fighting back, and the Viet Cong knew how to harness it with terrifying precision. When American or South Vietnamese troops fell into a punji trap, the pain was immediate. the bamboo spike driving into flesh, often through the boot, sometimes straight through a thigh or calf. But that was only the beginning. What followed was not just a physical wound, it was a calculated descent into misery. These bamboo stakes were not clean. Far from it. They were caked in human waste, animal feces, rotting meat, even venom from jungle plants or snakes. It was not just about piercing flesh, it was about poisoning the body and mind. Imagine the horror. You get pulled from a pit, your leg a mess of torn skin and bamboo splinters, but then the fever starts, the wound swells. It oozes. You can't walk. You are trembling, delirious, the infection seeping deeper each hour. Medics try to stop it. Sometimes they succeed. Sometimes they cut the leg off. And sometimes they can only ease the pain. And wait, that was the real purpose. These were not battlefield kills. They were invisible strikes that kept hitting, day after day. Soldiers began to understand the message. A single step could destroy your entire future. You might survive, but you would not walk right again. You might make it home, but not whole. And while you were pulled off the front lines, your squad had to carry the weight, literally. One man down meant more stress, more risk, more burden for the others. The traps did not just aim to disable individuals. They aimed to slow entire units, sap strength, and breed fear. Private First Class Harbert once stepped on what he thought was just soft ground. The bamboo pierced through his foot, and he fell instantly. At first, he thought he would be fine. It was not bleeding much. But by nightfall, the foot had ballooned to twice its size. The pain was unbearable. Within 24 hours, he was feverish, and the medics told him the wound was septic. He was airlifted out. He never returned to the jungle, but the jungle never left him. It was not the pain, he said later. It was knowing that a stick in the dirt nearly killed me. This method of warfare was ancient, and yet disturbingly modern. The use of biological contamination weaponized something as mundane as dirt. And worse, it forced Allied troops into a state of hyper-awareness that bordered on paranoia. Every injury had a second act. A shot to the arm might be survivable. A punji stake through the ankle, laced with rot, was a gamble with nature. And in the jungle, nature almost always won. And here's where it gets darker. These traps were not built and abandoned. The Viet Cong returned to them, maintained them, reapplied the toxins. In some cases, they would even wait nearby, watching as patrols passed, hoping one would spring the trap. And if someone did, if someone fell into that pit, the squad would scatter, the medics would rush in, and then the shooting might start. The trap was not just a weapon, it was bait. But the real genius, if you can call it that, was in the simplicity. These traps did not require advanced technology, no fancy explosives, no machinery, just bamboo, some twine, and a deadly understanding of how the human body works. The goal was not precision, it was suffering, the kind of suffering that traveled with the wounded. That screamed in the night. That made every soldier on patrol wonder, am I next? It changed behavior. Troops started moving slower. They used long sticks to poke the ground ahead. They watched where locals stepped and where they did not. Some even refused to go into certain parts of the jungle. The traps were winning, not by firepower, but by dread. Fear became the Viet Cong's greatest ally. Veterans talk about how the smell of rot still triggers memories, the stench of infection in the field hospitals, the sight of comrades with blackened wounds, unable to walk, the silence of a man who knows his leg is gone but has not dared to look down. One nurse, Patricia Johnson, said she could smell the infection before she even saw the wound. It clung to the air, she recalled, like the jungle itself was sick. And the worst part, these methods were not exclusive to punji pits. Snap traps, too, were sometimes tipped with filth. Even makeshift knives, fixed to spring-loaded whips, were dipped in waste. If the strike did not kill you, the infection might. It was a dual threat, one physical, one microbial. You were not just fighting the enemy, you were fighting disease, decay, and the jungle itself. There is a reason many call the Vietnam War the most psychological conflict of the 20th century. Because death was not loud, it was slow. It came in on the sole of a boot. It crept up through the bloodstream. It whispered in fevers and nightmares. And it reminded everyone out there that war did not need guns to ruin a life. Sometimes all it needed was a sharpened stick and a little dirt. The jungle did not need to be changed. It only needed to be unleashed. The Viet Cong understood that better than anyone. In a war where conventional weapons could not guarantee victory, they turned to something far more ancient and primal, nature itself. The vines, the mud, the bamboo, and the creatures. Not just animals, but assassins disguised as wildlife. Venomous snakes and scorpions, deadly, silent, and terrifying, became a part of their arsenal. You see, by the time American and South Vietnamese soldiers arrived in Vietnam, they had already been warned about punji traps, bouncing mines, and the tripwires. They expected danger from below. But what they did not expect, what nothing could prepare them for, was reaching into their backpack and finding it hiss back. Snakes, some of the most venomous in Southeast Asia, were used not just for shock, but for lethal precision. The Viet Cong would place them in bags, under logs, or inside supply crates, often in areas where troops would naturally reach without thinking. One story tells of a soldier preparing his night gear. He opened a pouch and out lashed a bamboo viper. It struck fast, sinking its fangs into his wrist. Within minutes, his entire arm went numb and he collapsed. Had his squad not responded quickly, he would have died before help could even be called. These were not accidents. These were traps, engineered, intentional, nature weaponized. In other cases, snakes were suspended in baskets or hollowed-out bamboo tubes rigged with tripwires. Step on the wrong patch of earth, and the trap would spring open, releasing a furious, venomous serpent into your path, or worse, into your tent. Imagine lying in the dark, already half mad from exhaustion, only to feel something cold and smooth slither across your chest. Then there were the scorpions. Not just left in the wild, but caged, placed in small woven containers made of reeds or bamboo, often tied near doors or hung just above head height. When disturbed, the containers would fall or burst open, scattering the scorpions over the unsuspecting target. These were not the kind of stings that gave you a mild rash. These were aggressive jungle scorpions, capable of sending a man into shock, and when pain and fear took hold, the soldier's mind broke down. He became a liability to himself and his unit. What made these traps even more insidious was how personal they felt. A landmine was terrifying but mechanical. A trap with bamboo stakes was horrific but expected. But venom, poison, that was betrayal by the earth, a natural element turned against you. And worse still, there was no certainty. A punji pit you could probe with a stick. A mine you might detect. But a snake in your helmet, a scorpion tied to your canteen strap, those were terrors you could not scan for. They were invisible until it was far too late. The fear seeped into everything. Soldiers began checking every piece of gear, shaking boots and helmets before putting them on. Some even refused to open crates unless absolutely necessary. Sleep came slowly. You did not just fear the enemy, you feared the jungle itself. The rustle in the leaves. The shift in your sleeping bag. Was it the wind or something with fangs? And it was not just for combat. The Viet Cong even used animals as psychological weapons in captivity. In one chilling account, prisoners were tied to trees and had bamboo cages filled with scorpions fastened to their necks. No movement, no escape. Just the slow, torturous threat of being stung over and over. One South Vietnamese officer later recounted how the sound of scorpions crawling near his ears haunted his dreams more than gunfire ever did. But perhaps the most twisted layer of this tactic was how nature itself could not be held accountable. These were not mechanical booby traps you could dismantle or disarm. These were living weapons creatures acting on instinct. The Viet Cong did not control the strike. They simply unleashed it. For the soldiers, it blurred the lines between reality and nightmare. A war where even reaching into your bag could kill you was a war where trust was lost entirely. Trust in the environment, in routine, in safety. And once trust is gone, fear takes over. That is when a soldier stops focusing on the mission and starts focusing only on survival. Veterans later spoke about how, even decades after the war, they would flinch at the sight of a garden snake, or jolt awake if they felt something brush their leg in bed. That is what psychological warfare looks like. When it succeeds, it leaves traces in the nervous system long after the fighting ends. So when we talk about the horrors of the Vietnam War, we must remember that it was not just fought with bullets and bombs. It was fought with silence, with shadows, and with the oldest predators of the earth. The jungle did not just hide the Viet Cong, it became one of them. And every hiss in the undergrowth, every sting in the dark, every whisper of scales against skin that was war too. Nature, twisted into a weapon that never ran out of ammunition. Beneath the dense, tangled canopy of Vietnam's jungles, beneath the traps, the whispers, and the shadows, there was another world. A world below ground, carved in silence, hidden in the soil. It was here, in the suffocating darkness of the tunnels, that the Viet Cong turned the very earth into their greatest ally. While U.S. and South Vietnamese forces scanned treetops and watched their footing for traps above, the true danger often lay below, silent, unseen, waiting. This was not just a network. It was a labyrinth, a subterranean city stretching over 250 kilometers in some regions. And it was not just for hiding. These tunnels were living, breathing arteries of war. The Viet Cong used them to transport weapons, store supplies, house wounded fighters, and even launch surprise attacks, all without ever being seen. One moment, a jungle trail appeared empty. The next, gunfire erupted from nowhere, and by the time reinforcements arrived, the shooters had vanished, swallowed by the earth. To understand the fear these tunnels created, you have to imagine the mindset of the soldiers facing them. You would be patrolling a village, thinking you had control of the area. Then a sniper opens fire from behind, or a grenade rolls out of a bush. You chase, but find nothing. No tracks, no footprints, just stillness. And somewhere under your feet, the enemy moves like ghosts. The U.S. military quickly realized that if they were going to win this war, they had to go underground. But not everyone could. The tunnel entrances were narrow, often no wider than a man's shoulders. They were buried in rice paddies, camouflaged under leaves, or built into termite mounds. Sending a platoon in was not an option. You needed someone small, someone brave, someone who could crawl into the bowels of the jungle and face whatever waited in the dark. They called them tunnel rats. Usually slight in build and armed with only a flashlight, a pistol, and nerves of steel, these men volunteered, or were sometimes volunteered, for one of the most dangerous jobs in the Vietnam War. Their mission was clear: enter the tunnels, map them, disarm traps, gather intel, and, if necessary, fight in close quarters. But nothing prepared them for what was inside. The tunnels were pitch black. The air was thick, hot, and stale. The walls pressed in from all sides. You crawled on your stomach inch by inch, heart pounding with every movement. One wrong step, and you might trip a wire or activate a hidden booby trap. There were punji pits inside, too. Tripwire grenades. Collapsing walls designed to crush intruders. Sometimes the Viet Cong even rigged the tunnels to flood if an outsider got too deep. And then there were the encounters. Face-to-face combat in a space barely wide enough to move. You did not just shoot, you wrestled, you choked, you survived by instinct. Every corner might be a dead end, or a dead man waiting. Sergeant Samuel Orozco, a well-known tunnel rat, once said, "You did not know if it was going to be a snake, a tripwire, or a man with a knife. You learned to stop breathing just to listen." It was not just physical danger, it was psychological warfare at its purest. Some tunnel rats emerged changed if they emerged at all. The pressure of crawling into darkness, alone, unsure if you would ever see daylight again, left mental scars deeper than the tunnels themselves. And yet, they kept going in. Because if those tunnels stayed untouched, the enemy would remain untouchable. Sometimes, clearing a tunnel led to heartbreaking discoveries. Underground hospitals with blood-stained mats, schools for child soldiers, or armories stocked with weapons meant for the next ambush. Other times, it led to death, a sudden blast, a cave-in, a strike in the dark. For the Viet Cong, these tunnels were not just hiding spots, they were lifelines. They allowed them to outlast airstrikes, disappear after attacks, and live for weeks without surfacing. While American soldiers were dropped in by helicopter and expected to fight and win in a foreign land, the Viet Cong lived inside that land, literally. They became the jungle, the soil, the silence. The Siu-Chi tunnels, the most infamous of these networks, have now become a tourist attraction. Guides walk visitors through widened, sanitized sections to show how the fighters lived. But what tourists see is a fragment, a carefully curated glimpse. The real tunnels were narrower, darker, dirtier, and alive with fear. No air conditioning, no lighting, no safety. Today, when we talk about guerrilla warfare in Vietnam, we often picture ambushes, booby traps, and sniper fire. But the true genius of the Viet Cong strategy was their ability to disappear, to fight on their terms. And the tunnels allowed them to do just that. They turned the ground into a weapon, a shelter, a trap. And for every tunnel rat who crawled in after them, it became a personal war. Not against an army, but against the unknown. So the next time you hear about soldiers facing danger in the jungle, remember this. Some of the bravest never saw the jungle at all. They were beneath it, facing the war from the inside out, one breathless inch at a time. They say war changes people, but in Vietnam, the change was not always from what you saw, it was from what you could not see. A footstep, a whisper, a rustle in the brush, a loose vine. Every movement held the possibility of pain, mutilation, or death, and the trauma that came from it did not fade when the wounds closed. For many, the worst scars were the ones buried, too deep to treat. Veterans who returned home often carried more than just medals and injuries. They carried memories of the jungle silence before a trap snapped shut, of screams echoing through the trees, of friends whose fates were decided not by bullets but by something far more sinister: bamboo spikes, hidden wires, cages of scorpions, the hiss of a snake in the dark. Private Leonard Thompson never forgot the day his foot hit a tripwire. He had barely taken 3 steps off the trail when the forest lit up. An explosion ripped through the air. The world spun. When he opened his eyes, he saw red where his legs should have been. The pain was indescribable, but the fear, the helplessness was what haunted him. It was not the blast, he recalled. It was the thought that I never even had a chance. Then there was John Harker. He had made it through dozens of patrols without a scratch, but one night, as he settled into his tent, he felt something move in his gear. Before he could react, sharp fangs sank into his arm. A bamboo viper. The venom worked fast. He lost all sensation within minutes, and the swelling crept up like fire under the skin. His team acted quickly. They saved his life, but he never fully regained strength in that arm. More than that, he could not sleep without the lights on for years. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the jungle watching him. Field medics remember the aftermath. Patricia Johnson was stationed at a mobile hospital near Da Nang. She said the worst were not the bullet wounds, it was the traps, the infected limbs, the rotting tissue, the kids who begged her not to cut their legs off. You would see a young man come in barely 19, with a hole in his thigh and bamboo still embedded. The smell would hit you before he did. And you knew, she whispered, you knew it was not going to be just one surgery. Or even two. It was a life sentence. Some soldiers came in laughing, masking the fear. Others sobbed the moment they were lifted from the chopper. Many never spoke. Not a word. Just stared at the ceiling. At nothing. Because they were not in the hospital anymore. They were still out there. Still in the jungle. Still hearing that snap. Sergeant Michael O'Brien, who was once caught in a net trap and dangled helplessly from a tree, told his family years later that it was not the humiliation that got to him, it was the seconds he spent alone, upside down, waiting for what would come next. He thought he would be shot, tortured, left to rot. But the Viet Cong never showed they did not have to. The trap had already done its job. For weeks afterward, he jumped at every sound, slept with his boots on, couldn't trust the ground he walked on. Then there is Nguyen Van Yu, a South Vietnamese lieutenant who fell into a tiger trap, one of those deep pits lined with sharpened bamboo, smeared with excrement. He was lucky. His comrades pulled him out before he bled to death. But the infection nearly took his leg. He spent 3 months recovering, only to return and walk with a limp that made him a slower, more vulnerable target. They told me I was healed, he said, but I was not whole. The jungle had taken something, my balance, my speed, my courage. The psychological warfare of these traps, that was the true genius of the Viet Cong's strategy. A bullet wound could be patched. But how do you treat paranoia? How do you stitch up fear? You can't bandage the feeling that every step might be your last, that every log might hide a snake, that the earth beneath your feet might give way to death. It was not just the soldiers who suffered. Medics, interpreters, even local civilians caught in the crossfire were left with scars. Some refused to talk about it. Others talked too much, as if saying it out loud would make it less real. Years after the war, some veterans tried to return tourists, visiting the Siu Chi tunnels, walking the cleaned-up trails. But many could not. The smell of damp soil, the sight of bamboo, the chirp of crickets at night, it was too much, too close. And yet, these stories survive, passed on in VA meetings, in whispered conversations, in journals hidden in closets. Not because the veterans want to relive the pain, but because they need us to understand that war was not just fought with guns, it was fought with poison, with silence, with dread. So when we think of Vietnam, we must think beyond battles and maps. We must think of the man who lost his hand to a whip trap, the medic who cleaned the same wound 4 times before infection set in, the soldier who flinched at every branch because he was not sure if it might bite back. This is the war that never made it into the textbooks, the war beneath the headlines. And it is still being fought in the memories of those who walked through the jungle, never knowing if the next step would be their last. The war ended. The treaties were signed. The helicopters flew home. But Vietnam never really healed, not completely. Beneath its rice paddies and forests, the war still breathed silent. patient, dangerous. Because many of the traps laid decades ago never detonated, never snapped. They simply waited. Even now, more than 50 years later, villagers still find them the hard way. A child playing near the edge of a field suddenly screams. Blood spills onto the grass. His foot had pressed down on a rusted pressure plate hidden under a layer of soft soil. It was not meant for him. It was meant for a soldier half a century ago. But it did not care. These devices never forget their purpose. They do not distinguish between combat boots and bare feet. In Quang Tri province, where some of the fiercest fighting once took place, families tilling the land still uncover buried landmines or bamboo punji traps. Some are intact, others shattered by time, but no less dangerous. Just a fragment of sharpened metal or rotting bamboo hiding under the mud is enough to change a life forever. And while government teams and NGOs work tirelessly to locate and remove these silent killers, the truth is chilling. There is no way to know how many are left. The war is over, but the legacy of those traps is not. Take the story of Akira, a former Khmer Rouge child soldier who, after surviving his own horrors, dedicated his life to disarming leftover landmines across Cambodia and Vietnam. He is now known for founding the Cambodia Landmine Museum, a place filled not with history books, but with real, rusted reminders of the past. Mines, traps, fragments, all carefully unearthed. Each item is a story, each one a life saved or lost. And it is not just the physical danger, it is the invisible wounds, the psychological aftershocks that ripple through generations. American and South Vietnamese veterans still dream of the jungle, not the trees, not the battles, the traps, the suddenness, the fear of every step. That tension does not dissolve with peace treaties. It festers, like the infections caused by punji stakes, slow, deep, consuming. John Thompson, a U.S. infantryman from the late 1960s, once shared a story with his daughter. He had been on a patrol, walking a trail cleared minutes earlier. Still, a trap found him. It did not kill him, just wounded, badly. But what hurt more, he said, was the moment right after the shame of not seeing it, the guilt of being the one who slowed the squad down, the sound of his friend's boots moving on without him, into more danger, possibly into more traps. Years later, his daughter noticed that John could not walk across a gravel driveway without watching the ground, couldn't picnic in parks, couldn't sit with his back to the woods. His body had healed, mostly, but his instincts had not. He never stopped walking like the ground might betray him. Patricia Johnson, the medic we have met before, said some veterans did not fear dying. They feared not knowing. The randomness of the traps, their cruelty, their creativity left men questioning the laws of nature. You would rather be shot, one soldier told her. At least then you know it is a fight. And the fear was not contained to the battlefield. Some veterans brought it home. Loud noises triggered them, sudden movements. The snap of a twig, a creaking floorboard in a quiet house. One veteran refused to open his garage for years. He said it reminded him of crawling into tunnel entrances. Another would not sleep on a bed. He said he could not trust anything higher than the floor. Even second-hand trauma lingers. Wives, sons, daughters listening to stories or witnessing outbursts, breakdowns, silences. The traps did not stop when the war did. They kept wounding people who were never there. And in Vietnam itself, entire communities live under the shadow of those buried weapons. Farmers walk carefully. Children are told which patches of land to avoid, not because of ghosts or spirits, but because of things planted long before they were born. Some local initiatives offer education, teaching children how to recognize old traps. Some NGOs provide prosthetics for those injured. But the emotional burden, that is harder to fix. A farmer who loses a leg to a 50-year-old mine does not just lose mobility, he loses work, confidence, dignity. The jungle has regrown, yes. The trees are green again. Tourists walk the Siu Chi tunnels, take photos, even laugh. But beneath their feet, the past is still alive. And maybe that is the final trap. Not the bamboo, not the wires, not the poisons, but the memory. The idea that war can ever truly be left behind when the tools of that war are still in the ground, still waiting, still breaking lives. So when we talk about the Vietnam War, we must do more than remember the soldiers. We must remember the soil, the traps, the fear, and the invisible lines that still divide land, body, and mind. Because war does not end when the guns go silent. It ends when the last wound stops bleeding, physical and psychological alike. And for many, that day has yet to come. In every war, there is a balance, a brutal equation between strength and strategy, firepower and finesse. And in Vietnam, that balance was shattered. The United States came with helicopters, napalm, and M16s. They had satellites, radar, tanks, and endless supply lines. On paper, the war should have ended quickly. But war is not fought on paper. It is fought in mud, in shadows, in silence. And in that silence, the Viet Cong found their advantage not through might, but through mind. Their weapons were not always guns. Often they were bamboo, fishing wire, sharpened sticks, and the land itself. Where America had B-52 bombers, the Viet Cong had traps. And these traps told a deeper story, one of survival, of resistance, and of a chilling creativity that turned everyday materials into instruments of terror. In many ways, these devices became symbols of something larger. How guerrilla tactics, when wielded with patience and precision, can humble even the most advanced militaries in the world. Think about it. A high-tech soldier, armored and armed to the teeth, could be brought to his knees by a stake hidden in the ground. A platoon trained for jungle warfare could be paralyzed by the fear of a single tripwire stretched across a path. All it took was uncertainty, a seed of doubt, a question that never left their minds. What is under my next step? That was the true power of the Viet Cong's strategy. They did not need to win every firefight. They just needed to wear down the enemy emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and with each trap sprung, they chipped away at the confidence of their opponents. It was not about killing the most. It was about changing the way the enemy fought, forcing them to crawl where they used to run, to doubt what they once trusted, to see every vine, every shadow, every puddle as a potential grave. Military experts call this asymmetrical warfare, when a smaller, less equipped force uses unconventional tactics to level the playing field. And in Vietnam, it was not just effective, it was devastating. Punji pits were not just holes in the ground, they were statements. We are here, we are watching, and you are never safe. Tripwires did not just detonate explosives, they detonated fear. Snake traps did not just injure, they made soldiers afraid of the jungle itself. Imagine turning an entire landscape against your enemy. Not just the terrain, but the trees, the leaves, the very earth. That is what the Viet Cong did. They did not hide in the jungle, they became it. And through this brutal ingenuity, they reminded the world of something that is easy to forget in the age of drones and satellites. War is still, at its core, human. And the human mind, when pushed into a corner, can be the most dangerous weapon of all. But what is perhaps most haunting is how these tactics endured. Even today, military historians study the Viet Cong's methods as examples of how low-tech warfare can counter high-tech force. In conflicts from Afghanistan to Syria, echoes of Vietnam can be seen: homemade IEDs, ambushes, tunnel warfare and psychological terror. Because war does not always reward the biggest army. Sometimes it rewards the most creative, and that creativity came at a cost. For the Americans and South Vietnamese, it meant a war that could not be measured in territory won or lost. It meant battles where the enemy was invisible, and the wounds came from below, or from within, from places you never expected. For the Viet Cong, it meant living underground, breathing stale air, surviving on almost nothing. It meant watching comrades die from the very traps they laid. But to them, the sacrifice was worth it, because they believed they were fighting for something greater, their land, their people, their right to resist. And for the civilians caught in between, it meant a war that dug into the ground and refused to leave. A war that still lingers today, in rusted wires and buried stakes. A war that can still explode with the wrong step. So yes, these traps are reminders, gruesome, visceral reminders of the horrors of war. But they are also proof that intelligence, resilience, and grit can shape the outcome of even the most lopsided battles. They show us that the greatest weapons are not always forged in factories. Sometimes they are carved from bamboo, planted by hand, hidden with care, and aimed not at the body, but at the mind. The legacy of Vietnam's traps is not just one of fear, it is one of warning. That war, no matter how advanced it becomes, will always find a way to break through steel and armor. It finds the cracks. It lives in the silence. It hides in the soil. And if we forget that, if we believe war is only about drones and missiles, we will be caught by surprise. Again, because the jungle has many lessons, and one of the most important is this: you do not have to see your enemy to be defeated by them. Sometimes all it takes is a vine, a whisper, a trap, and the war begins all over again. The traps of the Vietnam War were more than weapons. They were symbols. Symbols of desperation, of ingenuity, of resistance. They turned the ground itself into a battlefield where every step could decide a life. And long after the guns fell silent, they remain hidden, rusting, waiting. Some still tear through the flesh of farmers and children. Others lie beneath decades of earth, silent but not forgotten. But perhaps the most enduring traps are not made of bamboo or steel. They are emotional, invisible, embedded not in the ground, but in memory. For those who served on any side, Vietnam never truly ended. The sounds of the jungle, the tension of a single footstep, the split second between peace and pain. These sensations follow them home. They follow them into dreams, into daily life, into moments of quiet where the war echoes loudest. It is not just PTSD. It is a scar on the soul. And yet, amidst the horror, there was something else. There was courage. The kind that is not written in textbooks. The kind found in medics who kept patching up wounded men even when the blood would not stop. In tunnel rats who descended into darkness, knowing each breath could be their last. In the villagers who planted rice, raised children, and tried to live while death slept beneath their soil. There was also ingenuity, the ability to turn a handful of materials into a force capable of resisting the most powerful army on earth. But let us be clear, this is not a celebration of violence. It is a recognition of human adaptability, of what people do when they are pushed into corners with no other way to survive. And most importantly, there was loss. Not numbers, not statistics, but names, faces, stories. Young men who never came home, families who never got closure, lives changed forever by a simple step in the wrong direction. So what can we, watching this today, decades removed, take from it? Maybe it is this, that war is not glory, war is not the movies. It is fear, it is filth, it is the smell of infection in a jungle clearing. It is a mother waiting for a son who will never return. It is a soldier waking up in the night, unsure if he is still in the war. The traps remind us that the greatest wounds are often the ones we cannot see, and they warn us too. That conflict never truly ends when we leave land littered with pain. That the choices made in war echo for generations. That ingenuity, when fueled by desperation, can become something both brilliant and terrible. Let us remember the war not as a series of battles, but as a lesson. Let us honor the dead, yes, but also the living, the ones who carry the jungle in their minds, the ones who walk fields with careful feet, the ones who survived not by being stronger, but by being more afraid and moving anyway. And as we walk forward into our own uncertain times, may we carry this truth that no technology, no might, no map will ever outmatch the quiet, cunning will of a people who refuse to kneel. And may we never forget, some traps fade, others we carry forever